It's just after midnight, September 26, 1983. In a secret underground bunker outside Moscow, more than 100 Soviet officers are on duty, watching screens, waiting for a war that nobody wants to start. But tonight, one man carries a weight that none of the others do. His name is Stanislav Petrov. He's 44 years old, a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces. And in this room full of people, he is completely alone in the decision he's about to make. You've never heard of him. That's the point. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand what kind of world Petrov woke up in every morning. 1983 is considered by Cold War historians to be one of the most dangerous years in modern history. More dangerous, in some ways, than the Cuban Missile Crisis 20 years earlier. Reagan had just called the Soviet Union an evil empire on live television and announced plans for space-based weapons to intercept Soviet missiles. To Moscow, this wasn't defense. It sounded like preparation for a first strike. And just 3 weeks before this night, Soviet jets shot down a South Korean passenger plane that had drifted into restricted airspace. 269 people dead, including a sitting US congressman. Both sides had their nuclear forces on hair trigger alert, missiles ready to launch within minutes. No room for error, no room for doubt. This is the world Stanislav Petrov walked into for his night shift. The facility was called Serpukhov 15, buried underground north of Moscow, classified, scrubbed from official maps. Inside, a network of satellites called Oko, Russian for eye, watched the American missile fields around the clock. Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota. If any of those missiles fired, the system would detect the heat signature within seconds. What most people don't know about Petrov is this. He wasn't just a soldier watching a screen. He was a trained engineer who had spent years studying the algorithms inside the Oko system. He understood exactly how it worked and exactly how it could fail. That night, that knowledge would matter more than anything else in the world. Shortly after midnight, the bunker explodes. Not literally, but close enough. A siren tears through the silence. Every head in the room turns toward the main display. And there, in large red letters, a single word burns onto the screen. Launch. One American intercontinental ballistic missile launched from Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. The system's confidence rating, high reliability. The doctrine was simple. If they fire, you fire back before the missiles land. That was a mutual assured destruction. The deal was supposed to keep both sides from ever pulling the trigger. Petrov had roughly 10 minutes to decide. 10 minutes to determine whether the most powerful nation on Earth had just declared war. The room is in chaos, officers shouting, sirens going, every trained reflex in that bunker screaming. This is real. Report it. Now. But Petrov doesn't move. His first thought, one missile. He had been briefed hundreds of times on what an American first strike would look like. Not one missile, hundreds, launched simultaneously to obliterate Soviet nuclear capabilities before any response was possible. So why one missile? Then the screen updates. 4 more. 5 total, all headed towards the Soviet Union. The system's confidence still high, the alarm still sounding. But something still doesn't feel right. He checks the ground radar, secondary confirmation system. In theory, it should be picking up incoming missiles, but here's the problem every officer in that room understood. Ground radar cannot see over the curvature of the Earth. The missiles had only just been detected by satellite. They hadn't risen high enough yet for the ground radar to find them, which meant the silence from the ground proved nothing. Not that the missiles didn't exist, just that it was too early to confirm they did. Petrov was in a window of time where no secondary confirmation was even physically possible. He had to decide before the evidence could arrive. He would later say, "I had a sinking feeling in my gut." He wasn't sure. He was never sure. But 5 missiles from the most powerful military on Earth felt like an illogical opening move. The system was new, and his judgment unproven. The alert had passed through 30 layers of verification faster than anything real could. Stanislav Petrov picked up the phone. He called his commanders and told them it was a false alarm. Now came the hardest part. Waiting. He had no way to confirm the call he just made. Couldn't see the missiles, couldn't call the Americans. He had acted on engineering knowledge, instinct, and the conviction of a man who understood the system well enough to distrust it. And now he sat and waited. He later described those minutes as the longest of his life. I knew perfectly well that nobody would be able to correct my mistake if I had made one. The missiles never came. No impact, no explosion, no war. The investigation afterward traced the false alarm to a rare alignment of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds, caught by one OCO satellite at a particular angle, mimicking perfectly the heat signature of a missile launch. Sunlight off clouds. The most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis, triggered by sunlight off clouds. Here's where the story gets darker. Petrov was not honored. He was not decorated. First, his commanding general praised him, said the actions were correct. A reward was coming. Never came. Instead, Petrov was quietly reprimanded, not for his decision, but for a paperwork violation. While he was deciding whether to start World War III, he hadn't been filling out the correct forms. But the charge was a pretext. Everyone involved knew it. The Soviet military had spent billions building the OCO system. Senior generals and prominent scientists had staked their careers on it. And on September 26, 1983, that system had nearly started a nuclear war because of sunlight. If Petrov was officially rewarded, questions would follow. Questions nobody wanted to answer. And the people who needed to answer them were the same people deciding his fate. So they buried it. A paperwork violation was the cleanest way to make it disappear. Punish the man without acknowledging the reason why. He was reassigned. He took early retirement. For over a decade, Petrov told no one what he had done. Not his colleagues, not his neighbors, not even his wife. She found out 10 years later. She looked at him and said, "So what did you do?" He didn't know how to answer that. The world didn't learn about Stanislav Petrov until 1998, 15 years after it happened. A Soviet general mentioned it in an interview, almost in passing. Journalists picked up the thread. Slowly, the story began to surface. Former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon would later say that the nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union nearly occurred on that night, and was prevented only by the judgment of one man. In 2013, 30 years on, Petrov accepted the Dresden Peace Prize, 25,000 euros, the first official recognition he had ever received. He spent the money on a new television. In 2017, Stanislav Petrov died in his apartment outside Moscow. He was 77. A family friend discovered his passing months later. His name trended briefly. Politicians issued statements. Then the news cycle moved on. But here is what I want you to sit with before this ends. This was not a one-time glitch. Nuclear historians have cataloged dozens of near misses, moments where a technical error or a misread signal almost ended civilization. Just 5 weeks after Petrov's decision, NATO launched a military exercise called Able Archer 83, a simulation of a nuclear assault on the Soviet Union. The Soviets believed it was real. They mobilized military divisions, transported nuclear weapons to launch sites, and handed Yuri Andropov the nuclear briefcase. A senior NATO intelligence officer noticed the Soviet response and chose not to escalate. That decision ended it. 2 near misses, 5 weeks apart, both quietly buried. Petrov believed he had just done his job, that anyone in his position would have done the same thing. But they wouldn't have. His colleagues, military men trained to follow protocol, would almost certainly have reported the alarm. This system was designed for compliance, not judgment. It rewarded certainty. It punished hesitation. Petrov hesitated, and that hesitation is the reason you're here. Petrov spent his final years in a small apartment in Friesville, Russia. Occasional interviews, a handful of awards from organizations most people had never heard of. He was uncomfortable with the phrase, "the man who saved the world." He found it too large to carry. He preferred to say he was simply in the right place at the right time. But here's the uncomfortable truth in that modesty. The systems we build, the protocols, the chains of command, the automated warnings, they're only as good as the humans inside them. And most of the time, we design those systems to remove human judgment from the equation, because human judgment is slow and unpredictable and uncomfortable. On September 26, 1983, human judgment was the only thing that worked. Wherever you are right now, you are only here because a 44-year-old Soviet engineer sitting alone in the weight of a decision no human being should ever have to make decided to trust himself over the machine. He never asked for your gratitude, but he has it. This story stayed with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, ones that fell through the cracks of history, subscribe. There are more of them than you think.